I meant to push that button. So the dead weight loss that's up there is just the lost gains from trade in the concrete market. Doesn't actually say which market, but I prefer concrete examples. I suppose from Cowan and Tabarrok, it's probably the oil market, since that's their common theme throughout the book. If I ever write a book, mine will be the concrete market, because I believe in concrete examples. Okay, so 2 or 3 or more of these things will be things you'll be figuring on the exam on October 15th. And so there it is, in case you want to talk about it some more and whether it's sufficiently clear at this point. You know, it's probably not. You're probably thinking, you know, it's not totally clear, but there's a homework assignment and a learning curve and all of that, and so maybe it'll get there in the meantime. See, now here's where you have to go by experience. How did that work out for you on the first test? Okay, I mean, we had a good first test, and most of you did pretty well. But if it didn't work out so well in the first test, where you assumed that you would eventually figure it out, maybe you better learn from that experience and intervene at a little bit earlier stage rather than, whoops, it's time for the test and I still don't get it. Now it's too late to get any help. Okay, so do your learning curve. That's where the misses are free, right? And then you do the homework where the misses are cheap. And hopefully by then you get almost all of it out of your system. Yeah, you're still going to miss some. We're human. I could probably take my own test and missed 1 or 2 of them just because my mind wanders or something. So you want to get it down to where you just miss a few by accident, right? It's probably going to happen in any event. Okay, let's see. Should I go to slideshow mode? Why not? It could look a little bigger for those of you who insist on sitting way in the back, and then I have to do this extra pushing of the button. What do you think about this thought-provoking example? What's true for something like insulin? It's a drug, in case you know what's insulin. It's a drug. Diabetics take it, continue their lives. I'm not sure if any other kinds of medical conditions are addressed by this drug, but I know the big use of it is for diabetics. So what do you think? Highly elastic, highly inelastic, likely to be more elastic or inelastic than supply? What do you think? If we put a tax, highly inelastic, that's exactly right. So if we do our little E sub S divided by E sub D, we're going to get a number a lot bigger than 1, right? Because the E sub D on the bottom, sorry, I do that paragraph stuff. Go ahead and write that down. The tax burden on the buyers is that ratio. That's their share. All right, that's the ratio of the buyer's share to the seller's share. Yes, I didn't mean to have the elasticity of supply on the top. Right? Again, think it through. If the elasticity for the sellers is high, which means they have close available substitutes in terms of production, and there's a tax imposed, well, they can switch to something else easily, right? Not pay the tax, not bear that burden. So, and then likewise for the buyers, if they can easily switch to a consumption substitute, this number will be high, and this ratio will be small, which means the buyers will bear a small share of the burden, right? Makes sense. All right, so in case of insulin, what would you predict here? The numerator is going to be a lot bigger or smaller than the denominator? Smaller or bigger? Okay, let's see. We determine the E sub S. The E sub D is going to be very low, right? So the E sub S is going to be what? Really a lot higher. Okay, so the buyer's share of the burden is going to be very, very high. Right? E sub S over E sub D for insulin is going to be a very large number. Right? Because you don't buy the insulin if doctors prescribed it for you, you're going to die. Now, it turns out that it's not totally inelastic. Price almost always does matter. It's incredible. Well, what do you do if you're a diabetic and the price of insulin is going up and your budget's tight? You shrink the dose a little bit. Not much, but you try to get a few more doses out of the amount that you have. Okay, so price almost always does, and not every one of them will, but when you raise the price of something, less will be purchased, even when it seems like it's a need. People will figure out a way to get by with a little bit less. Not everybody, but some will. But the demand will be highly, highly inelastic, a very steep demand line. Now, assuming the government desires heroic assumption sometimes, desires to minimize the cost to society of taxation. There have to be taxes. We have to pay for things like soldiers and cops and firemen and all those things. We've got to pay for it somehow. So the idea would be, presumably, to acquire those dollars at minimum cost to society. So what do you think? Tax things which are the demand for which is highly elastic or inelastic, which one of those would do the least dead weight loss? Right? The one that changes the quantity the least, right? And therefore, either the demand or the supply would have to be highly inelastic for you to prefer to tax it. Right? Draw the graph. I'll skip drawing it. This will be one for you to draw, which better be part of your study process. Draw lots of graphs and turn things from words into models. Okay, so this particular thing, the model would be where you would explore different combinations of different slopes for the supply lines and the demand line. And you'll find that if one of the lines is steep, if they both are, sure, but if at least one of the lines is steep, the quantity won't be changed a whole lot by the tax, okay, which means the dead weight loss won't be all that large. Okay, so you want to tax things where the quantity won't change a lot. You want to tax things typically where the economic outcomes that result from freedom aren't greatly affected by levying a tax on something. Or somebody once said, you want to pluck the chicken without making it scream. It's kind of the same idea. You want to extract the dollars without causing too much of a fuss, too much change in the economic outcomes. All right, on to subsidies now. It's the reverse of a tax. Now we're going to give money instead of take. Oh, one more thing on taxes. There's an exception to what I just said. Those would be called sin taxes. S-I-N, sin, things that we regard as, we wish there were less of it, probably not zero. Pollution, maybe intoxicated behavior, including especially driving, right? So maybe we want to put a tax on alcohol. If we were to legalize drugs, we would definitely want to extensively tax that in order to finance the side effects of people doing that, including possibly driving under the influence. Okay, so sin taxes are a case where you would not want to. I guess it's not a choice if it's elastic or not, but there you wouldn't care, right? Because the whole idea is to change the quantity. That's the idea of a sin tax. Is to change the amount through the tax. Keep kids from starting to smoke, right, by putting a tax on cigarettes, making the cigarettes more expensive. As you know from a previous example, the elasticity for the adults is awfully low, but it's much higher for kids. They're not hooked yet, and they tend to have less money, so they're more sensitive to price. All right, now on to the subsidies then. Say, reverse of a tax, right? You see the graphs that I put over here for ready reference. However, the same equation here in terms of the benefits of the subsidy. Again, there's a cost too, right? It's got to be financed, which is kind of an interesting issue. Let's see, taxation yields a dead weight loss, right? We just determined that. And where do we get the money for a subsidy? So hopefully, we've determined that the benefits of the subsidy, hopefully eliminating some sort of a dead weight loss or some other socially significant issue, outweighs the fact that we're going to create a problem through the tax needed to finance it. However, if we can get the money from a sin tax, then we don't have to worry about that problem, right? Because a sin tax improves just from the tax being collected, improves the economic situation, makes it more efficient, like taxing pollution, less pollution, taxing things that have spillover effects like drinking alcohol or mind-boggling drugs. By taxing them, just to collect the tax, things are better. And then we have the money and we can do good things with that, either pay for the cops and the soldiers and the firemen, or subsidize things that are socially beneficial by some measure. Okay, so hopefully we can finance these subsidies without resorting to taxes that create dead weight loss, which means hopefully from sin taxes. Those don't always generate enough money to finance all the subsidies. Okay, so I think Cowan and Tabarrok just probably cut and paste this little section that where it says some truths about subsidies. They changed the word tax to the word subsidies, and it doesn't, it's the same thing. It doesn't depend on whether it's levied on the buyer or the seller. The effect on the market price and burdens and all that stuff is exactly the same. And the subsidies create a deadweight loss unless they're for things that are the opposite of sinful. Merit goods is usually the term applied to them. Like, for example, what would be a merit good? Education is a merit good, right? It creates spillover effects on other people, right? The more smart people there are, the more benefits there are to other people who are not financing their own education, but are benefiting from other people being smarter. How about drugs for contagious diseases? Those are merit goods, right? Because when somebody takes those, you're less likely to get sick, right? Because they're less likely to carry the disease and have you get infected. Okay, so, except in those cases where the subsidy is for a merit good, like, for example, let's say we subsidize medicine because we believe there's an equity issue there and that people are entitled to health care without having the ability to pay for it. Well, unfortunately, as we'll demonstrate in a minute, that will create a deadweight loss. In other words, the additional consumption will cost society more than that additional consumption is worth, what the willingness to pay for it is. Okay, that people will consume, for example, health care that they would not consume if they had the money and had to pay for it themselves. You've experienced that possibly, or you've heard about it, right? You go into the doctor and the doctor does the diagnosis and they say, oh, well, we can take care of this. This will cost a couple $1,000s though. And you go, a couple $1,000s? Oh, wow, doc, it doesn't really hurt all that bad. Will I get well on my own? And yeah, in time your body will heal itself. It'll take a while and it'll hurt and so on. And you're thinking, wow. And then the doctor says, well, now hold on a minute. And one thing I didn't tell you is your insurance covers this. So yeah, it's $2,000, but your share is only $200. Oh, doc, well, go for it. Let's take care of this. I don't want to suffer any longer as long as somebody else is going to pay for it. See, that's where that deadweight loss comes from. It's called a moral hazard. Right? You didn't want it when it was going to be on your tab, right? When it was going to be out of your pocket, the whole $2,000. But when somebody else is paying for it, of course you're paying for everybody else's bills where they're paying for yours, right? That's the nature of subsidies. But at that moment in time, that other stuff that you can't help paying other people's bills anymore, and now somebody's ready to pay some of yours, and you're saying, yeah, if I only have to pay a tenth of the bill, I want it. If I have to pay the whole thing, no, it doesn't hurt all that bad. I'll get better on my own. I really want to pay for that trip that I had in mind, or that stereo that I wanted to buy, or that cool iPhone that I had my eyes on, and I'd rather have that than get better faster with this treatment. Okay, so subsidies do yield a deadweight loss, just like most taxes do. And again, it's most subsidies. If it's a subsidy for something like a contagious disease or up to a point for schooling, that alleviates deadweight loss rather than creating it. Okay, so the subsidy, for better or for worse, distorts, changes. Distort's kind of an ugly word, isn't it? Changes, okay, but most of the time that's a bad. So distorts the market so that the price paid by the buyer will now be different than the price received by the sellers. Okay, so, but again, the market outcome doesn't depend on who gets the check from the government. Okay, so it reverses, tempted to say on my right or left, on your left versus your right, subsidy as taxes on your left, subsidies on your right. Okay, so now, actually what they both have in common is they will increase the price. Right, whether you tax something or put a subsidy on something, they will both increase the price. Right, one will increase the price because of reduced supply, and the other one will increase the price because of increased demand. Okay, now the tax reduces the net receipts of the seller, okay, and the subsidy will increase the net receipts of the seller, even while it reduces the net cost to the buyer. In both cases, they share the burden or the benefit in the short run. Now, what do you suppose happens over here? What happens over here in the tax in the long run? Okay, profitability is affected. Okay, and then sellers exit, so in the long run, the buyers bear all the burden. Over here, what happens? Let's say this is a subsidy that benefits sellers. Profitability goes up, right? So that causes market entry. So in the long run, the benefits, all the benefits go to the buyers. Again, assuming low entry barriers. And that's why the sellers lobby sometimes is, we subsidy, but restrict entry into the market, because see, then the sellers get some of the subsidies, get to keep some of the subsidy monies in the long run, if they can restrict market entry. But if there are no entry barriers in the long run, the buyers get all the benefits of the subsidy, because sellers will enter a market until the profit level is about normal for the economy as a whole. It's just common sense. If you think about it, I know it's a revelation at first, and oh boy, more economics to remember, but just think about it a little bit. Okay? There are entrepreneurs out there looking for a way to make a buck. Which industry are they going to go into? Where the profit level seems the highest. When are they going to stop going into it? When the profit levels fall into where it's just kind of normal for an industry in the economy. Right? Nothing to struggle with there in terms of learning it and keeping track of it. It's just, once you process it a little bit, it's just common sense. Okay, so moving right along here, here's a, I don't know why they put the graph in there in stages, but remember I borrowed these from the publisher and then I edit them. So if you copied one for note-taking, as I've recommended that you do, make sure you keep a lookout for where I edit them if I do. And you put a little arrow there and write in there that I changed a word or something. Okay, so nothing exciting about this graph yet. It's just our basic supply and demand relationship. But now we add the subsidy in there, and the subsidy is going to shift either the demand or the supply by the amount of the subsidy, right? So the difference between the original supply and demand, the new quantity is going to be where the subsidy is the difference between the original supply and demand. And again, I forgot my laser pointer. Whether you're at the bottom end of the arrow there or the upper end of the arrow depends on whether the suppliers are paid the subsidy monies or whether the demanders are. But either way, you're going to end up with the same quantity, and the prices to the seller is going to be the same, and the net price after the subsidy is going to be the same to the buyers. All right, so now we're back to this thing that I jumped the gun on a little bit. All right, who gets the benefits of the subsidy? It again depends on the relative elasticities. See, so the nice part of the second part of the chapter is it's mostly review, but with a little bit of a twist, so you have to pay attention. Okay, but it's mostly review. Okay, the less elastic side of the market will receive the greater share of the subsidy. Again, kind of like a cut and paste from an earlier slide on taxes where you just change the word tax to the word subsidy and the word benefit to the word cost. Okay, the less elastic side of the market will receive the greater share of the subsidy. Okay, and you'll see this from the graphs that are up on the slides in just a minute. Okay, so whichever side of the market bears the burden of a tax receives the benefit of a subsidy. Cool. Okay, so here we evolve our graph once again. Okay. So you see, if you have very inelastic supply, okay, so the number on the top is small relative to the number on the bottom here on this ratio, you'll see that the subsidy mostly goes to the seller. Okay, the less elastic side gets most of the benefit. Right, the price rises quite a bit. Right, seller says, "Cool, love it," and the buyer says, price to me is almost exactly the same as it was before. Where's the subsidy? Oh, well, sellers got it all because the supply was relatively inelastic. Think about this in terms of college education. One of the later slides gets into this, which you might have noticed. This is kind of the picture there. It's not easy to start a college, right? And it's not all that easy to expand an existing one, right? So the supply of places to enroll in to get a college education is pretty inelastic. So when there are subsidies for it, student loans and grants and all that, Pell Grants, most of the benefit goes to, hey, loving it. Well, actually, it doesn't so much go to me, but to administrators and empire builders that are trying to make UTSA bigger. And it's nice in many ways because there's more staff to support us and all of that. But the students are saying, hey, I'm reading about all these subsidies and my cost keeps going up and up, even though I've got these loans and grants and all that. Loans I got to pay off someday. Well, there you go. There's the explanation of it. I know that doesn't make you feel much better, but there it is. See, it's not easy. There are entry barriers, just high costs, regulations, and the fact that if you're a private entity, you don't get to the subsidy dollars that you get if you're a public university, right? Much of the costs here at UTSA are financed out of taxes. Right? So if you want to start up a new university, it either has got to happen at the state legislature, which doesn't happen very often. If it happens privately, well, then you have to charge a lot more tuition, which makes it harder to sell the product than if you're a public university. So again, the bottom line is that it's very inelastic, and the supply line doesn't shift much over time because there are a lot of entry barriers for that market, the higher education market. Question, comments, thoughts? Okay. So just said all of this, although maybe not necessarily with all of the hieroglyphics. Benefit to the buyers, benefit to the sellers is, again, the same as the cost to the buyers divided by the cost to the sellers when we were talking about taxes. Same ratio, E sub S to E sub D. Notice that I prefer the curvy S, the curvy E's. Economists, we love our Greek alphabet, so it's sort of still an E, but it's kind of like epsilon or something. Is that what it is? Greek alphabet, epsilon. I think that's right. I can't remember what letter it stands for in the Greek alphabet, but we love it anyway. Because we have all our formulas are in Greek symbols. Okay, so we're ready to do the dead weight loss thing. And let's see, got a graph here. Okay, so there's the, see now the dead weight loss is on the other side. Ooh. Again, don't try to memorize this. There are so many different combinations. If you don't understand what you're doing, you're going to mess it up. Okay, so try to think through the economics here. Why is the dead weight loss over there on the other side of what the equilibrium was? Okay, remember the equilibrium maximizes the gains from trade. So what are we doing here? We're giving some of it back. Right, overkill. Doing too much of something means you're giving back some of the gains from trade that you would have had if you'd stopped a little sooner. Okay, so beyond Q market there, the supply line is above the demand line. What does that mean? That means the opportunity cost for any additional output past where it says Q market, anything to the right of that, additional output costs more, the supply line cost, than it's worth, the demand line. Okay, so again, you could find that dead weight loss the hard way and estimate the loss per each additional unit. Let's take the area of the triangle. Simple. It's a shorthand way of adding up a bunch of transactions. Okay, so past Q market, each additional unit of output adds more to cost than it does to benefit. So why does it happen? Well, because that person's standing there saying, well, it's not a cost to me. Right? For the cost to me, I want it. Oh, what about the cost of that? I can't get that money back. So those are fixed costs. Those are sunk costs. Now, you're not going to get a refund on your taxes when you don't accept a subsidy for something that's subsidized. Okay? And we'll do some calculations here momentarily just to nail that down. Remember, I love teensy-weensy amounts of math in things because it defeats memorization. So keep that in mind. Here's a couple of examples. Yeah, it's amazing. The first bullet item, and there's not enough detail there for you to. Oh, Felix, yes. Huh? Oh, sure.
So the immediate effect of a tax would be a consumer surplus, and so therefore for a
okay. The consumer surplus would start from price paid to buyers and would be the entire area under the demand line. Yeah.
It'll be a producer surplus, right? For a tax, sort of like immediate effect of tax, right? Because it was pushed to the left.
I'm struggling to hear you, so.
So if you put a tax on it, it would be on the left side, right?
Right. If you put a tax on it, it's on the left side because the deadweight loss occurs because of underproduction.
Yeah, there would be like so it'd be a producer shortage or a surplus?
Well, with the tax, there's initially a surplus
But then with
because the immediate effect of the higher price is to say, the seller says, hey, I'm passing on the tax, and the buyer says, no, you're not, at least not all of it. And so then there's a surplus, and then the price has to come down a little bit.
okay, so with the subsidy being the complete opposite.
Initially a shortage. Okay, and then because of the shortage, the price has to go up. Okay, so in the kale case, this is a good point. In the case of a tax, the price jumps up when the tax goes into effect, and then it comes back down a little bit, but it's still higher than it used to be. In the case of a subsidy, the price, goes down a little bit first, then there's a shortage, and the price has to go up in order to eliminate that shortage. Okay, and it's higher than net for the seller, and lower after that a little bit for the buyer. And exactly the opposite of the case with the subsidy, except that the price is higher in both cases. Okay, so in the case of there's not enough detail provided here. So don't want to delve into too many details, especially writing them out on the slide. But we're growing high water intense crops in places like Arizona, southern Arizona, where it's like 120 degrees in the shade 5 or 6 or 7 months of the year. Why is that? Well, because they built big reservoirs thinking that water was a need, and water is a need, but only for small quantities. So they built these giant reservoirs on the Colorado River and some other rivers in Arizona, the Gila River, thinking, okay, water's a need, well, we better capture all we can. And then they said, okay, here's what the water cost, who wants it? And farmers and others who could use a lot of water said, at that price, I don't want any of it, or hardly any of it. And they said, well, what do we do with this water? It's kind of embarrassing to build these big old giant reservoirs and have no customers. They thought it was a need, inelastic demand. No, it was very elastic other than a small quantity, right? And a little bit of it was inelastic. The amount you got to drink every day and wash and clean, that's highly inelastic demand. But the demand curve for water looks like this. Sorry, draw my graphs again. It goes like that. See? Very inelastic for small quantities, but very elastic for large quantities, right? Steep, inelastic, not so steep, very elastic down here. So they didn't want to not have anything to do with the water at all. So they built the reservoirs. There was the water. They had to do something with it. So they practically give it away in Arizona, where water is supposedly, it is extremely scarce, in order to put it to some use. And so we're growing cotton in Arizona rather than in Alabama to some extent, which is just mind-bogglingly bizarre. But that's what that point gets at there. It diverts scarce resources to low-value uses, and we produce things in places that have a comparative disadvantage, to say the least, instead of places that have a comparative advantage growing them. Okay, again, an elasticity story. Water's a need, yes, but needs can be met sometimes with small amounts of something, and then there's more, and then the additional quantity is not a need, it's a want. Water is valuable to irrigate crops. Okay? How valuable? Not valuable enough to build a big giant hunk of concrete on a river in a desert someplace to supply the water for. It's not valuable enough for that. Oh, whoops. Mistake. The economic illiteracy can be very expensive when it's assumed to be a need up to as much as you can find. No, it's only a need up to a little bit. A few gallons per person per day is a need, not much. By the way, did you know that the average water consumption in most places is about 100 to 200 gallons per person per day? Is that a need? No, I think you can probably conduct your biological functions on a lot less than that. So what's the rest? Washing your car, filling up the swimming pool if you have one, and landscaping and all of that. Those aren't needs, those are wants. Okay? Valuable, right? People desire them. but not worth the money we spend on them in many cases. Water's heavily subsidized, largely out of economic illiteracy in a lot of places. In a lot of places, water's not metered. A lot of cities, water's not. What does that mean? It means they don't bill you based on how much you use. They just send you a flat rate bill. What message does that send? Water's free. Even if the flat rate is high, there's no additional charge for using additional water. Okay, so at the margin, it feels free. So people build lush jungles in their yard, and they water them extensively with big old sprinkler systems, swimming pools, all of that. And speaking of Arizona, and I was, Phoenix and Tucson, the big cities in southern Arizona, they differ in terms of how they charge for water. Phoenix, big, lush water using, because they don't bill according to the cost of the water very extent. They may still, I haven't checked in a while, I don't know for sure. But anyway, the water is very cheap in Phoenix, artificially so. In Tucson, no, water's pretty expensive. What's the difference? In Tucson, people have rock gardens. In Phoenix, they have lush gardens, okay, which is worth something, but not what the water costs. Okay, and then another point up here. There are different ways to achieve certain goals. You've probably heard that the minimum wage is constantly an item up for debate. Well, there's an alternative to that called wage subsidies. And let's take a look at these differences here. Minimum wage is a price floor, right? If we mandate a higher wage than the market wage, it's going to make labor more expensive, unskilled labor more expensive, right? The minimum wage doesn't apply to most people because they're already making more than that. But it makes unskilled labor more expensive in some places. And how does that hurt people? It says that it hurts. Wait a minute, how does a raise hurt? Well, because they can't find a job. Right? The law of demand says if you make something more expensive, okay, there will be less of it purchased. Right? So some unskilled laborers that would otherwise find employment won't. Nothing controversial about that. Even people that support the higher minimum wage agree to that. They do, however, disagree to some extent about the elasticity of demand. I met a person at the conference over the weekend, an economist, pro-minimum wage, and he said, yeah, it does reduce employment, but not much, right? That's an elasticity statement. Okay, so to him it was worth it that some would get a raise even if some wouldn't be able to find a job, a trade-off. So what about this wage subsidy business? See, that's a way to get around that trade-off, to not have to make that trade-off. Of course, it has its own issues. Okay, so here's a graph of what's going on with the minimum wage, right? You set the wage above point A, right? A is the market equilibrium. So the quantity demanded falls from Q market to Q demanded, and the quantity supplied, the amount of people that want to work, increases from Q market up to Q supplied. Okay, but the amount of people that will be working and the amount of jobs available, that's point C, Q demanded. Okay, and so some would argue that, okay, the objective of the minimum wage law is a good one. Maybe the elasticities are small, maybe they're not, but how can we just avoid that debate totally and not worry about reducing job availability, still help out those low-skilled workers? Well, the answer from, go back to this other slide, is the wage subsidy. Okay, so let's go to the description of that. See, what does a wage subsidy do? It increases the demand for labor. Okay, so the workers get more, and the employers pay less. Sounds like a winner, doesn't it? So why is all the public policy debate about minimum wage and hardly any mention at all of why don't we have wage subsidies? What's the difference between the two policies? Yeah, the wage subsidy has to be financed, right? And the government loves things that feel free. To the government. Right? They don't want to take money away from other programs that are buying votes. Right? If they didn't raise taxes, that's what they'd have to do to finance the subsidy. Remember, a tax on something, especially something that would be as expensive as a wage subsidy, probably not going to be able to get all that money from a sin tax or even from a series of them. Although a carbon tax, against global warming, that would raise an awful lot of money. That could probably eliminate a lot of the income tax. But short of something gargantuan like that, a wage subsidy is going to have to be financed onto the income tax, which is a tax on something good, not on something bad. So the government loves things that feel free, which means, why don't we just mandate that employers do this? Pay the higher wage instead of increasing the demand for labor and thus increasing the wage that the workers get. You see, there's the issue there. The minimum wage feels free, right? Because it's free to the government, other than the enforcers that have to go around and detect and punish someone figuring out a way to pay less than the minimum wage, which, by the way, isn't all that hard to figure out how to do while seeming to still pay the minimum wage. So there's a fair amount of enforcement going on out there to do that, making people work overtime, right? And we're not paying overtime. Because how can you pull that off if there's a minimum wage? Because now there's a surplus of people wanting a job. Right? With the minimum wage, there's people standing in line waiting for the job that you have. So the employer can lean on you to do a lot of things that you might otherwise agree to do. And the employer says, hey, look, if you're not interested in the requirements of this job, step aside, please. I've got a lot of applicants that would love to take your place. It's like, okay, well, I better not complain, or I'll lose this deal. I mean, yeah, you can complain to the government and get your boss in trouble, depending on how well disguised their scheme is. But then what? You probably lost your job, right? And if in these conditions of labor surplus, right, unemployment is a labor surplus, you're going to have a tough time finding another job, especially if it gets out that you complain to the government as a result of issues that you come up with. All right, so a wage subsidy, as opposed to the minimum wage, increases the wage received by the workers and avoids the surplus and reduces the wage paid by businesses at the same time. Okay, here's another interesting example that Cowan and Tabrock have come up with. Let's see, to promote energy independence, there's a subsidy to corn growers if they convert corn to ethanol. They have to be given the subsidy. Why? Otherwise, they can't sell the ethanol. Now, they have to be in order for this to work. Right? The ethanol is not competitive with other ways to make gasoline without that subsidy. So the subsidy comes along because we don't want to import as much oil as otherwise. We want to use our ability to grow corn to cover for some of that. In the United States, I think we're about 10 or 15% of what goes into the gas tank now comes from corn rather than from an oil well someplace. Okay? So it does offset about 10 or 15% of our fuel consumption, but not for free by any stretch of the imagination. It's driven up the price of corn and everything made from corn and everything that's a consumption substitute or a production substitute for corn. And then in the terms of the subsidy, we talked about the second one already. In terms of the subsidy, it makes it lucrative for corn producers to do this because the price to them is higher. And the price then to the petroleum companies to mix it in with gasoline is lower. Who gets the most of the subsidy dollars? Let's see, is the supply elasticity high or low for corn? Let's see. I would imagine that the supply elasticity for corn is pretty low, right? It's not all that hard to plant some additional corn. You just plant fewer acres of other stuff. So who gets the benefit then? Probably the purchasers of corn, right? I would imagine, okay, to the extent that there are any benefits. Okay, so we're coming towards the end of the chapter here. And we'll be moving on to chapter 7 here in a minute after we do the top hat question. But first, a little bit of overview here. Okay, takeaway means summary. Okay, so we have to have taxes because we have to pay for government functions. And in this chapter, we studied a particular kind of tax because it's the easiest kind to study, and especially after a chapter on elasticities, a tax on goods, okay, commodity tax, and tax effects doesn't depend on who actually pays the government, and the impact on buyers and sellers depends on the relative elasticities, and it creates deadweight loss just from reducing the amount produced, because at the margin, the additional output, once you have a tax in place, is worth more to buyers out there than it costs to make it. So why isn't it made? Because of the artificially higher price that results from taxation that depresses consumption. Let me go back to that. Question, comment, thought on any of this? Fear, loathing? Like, oh, I don't want to have him ask this on the test. Well, I will. Okay, so kind of think about what aspect of it concerns you the most. Okay, and the second part of the chapter, although it took quite a bit less time than the first part. Oh, let's talk about one kind of a subsidy before we move on to the top hat questions. We have Obamacare, right? And before that, we still had extensive third-party payment for health care. How does that look? That's a subsidy. Okay, so let's go back to the basics here and always start with that in case you're still not too solid on what is this 30? That's the highest price that anybody's willing to pay for this healthcare service. Okay, somewhere out there, somebody, if they're pushed, would fork over $30 for this, for one unit of this stuff, right? Price per unit over here. Now, suppose we come up with a scheme that says, people should be entitled to this stuff. Yeah, we should charge them something for it, co-payments and deductibles, right? But not make them pay the full cost. How about we make the patient share 30%? We've got to make it 33%, 1/3. How would that affect this? Okay, so now the government or insurance company is going to pay 2/3. Okay, so the buyer's share is now 1/3. Now what's the maximum willingness to pay for this good now that the buyers only have to pay 1/3 of the cost? What's the equivalent in terms of you paying part of the bill to the $30 when you pay all of the bill? Huh? No, you're going the other way. 90, that's right. Because see, if the bill is 90 and you only have to pay 1/3 of it, you're still paying just $30. You're still thinking, yeah, thumbs up, good, I'm good for it. So what's the basic rule of thumb here? The reciprocal of the patient's share is the amount by which demand increases. Okay, the patient share was 1/3, reciprocal is 3. Okay, so a 2/3 subsidy. So you got to work through the numbers here a little bit. A 2/3 subsidy, which means 1/3 onto the buyer, 2/3 for somebody else. A 2/3 subsidy, which means the buyer still has to pay for 1/3 of whatever the bill is. A 2/3 subsidy will triple demand. Okay, from the subsidy, you can determine the buyer's share and then the reciprocal of that. Okay, so now what happens? Break the chalk. See, that's why I drew the demand down here. I had to give myself some room. Okay, so if you put the low quality chalk, it's just too long, I guess. Okay, so here was Q0. This will be Q1. Okay, so it's not as neat anymore now as if the demand line or supply line shift in some parallel sense. Okay, well, this is probably more normal than that. Okay, although I suppose when we subsidize a commodity, it usually or it can easily be a per unit amount. But here it's a percentage amount. Okay, this graph is with the subsidy rate being 2/3. Okay, which means the buyer's paying 1/3. Okay, take the reciprocal of that. So let's see what has that done to the price. Here's P0. Just by sort of a quirk there, the way that I drew it, it looks like the price doubles. Okay, you'll get a bill, and you'll compare that to what you used to pay and think, wait a minute, I thought I was only supposed to pay 1/3 of it. I'm paying half. Right? The new price is twice what my share of it is. The amount before is half of what. So you're thinking, it's because it drove up the price of it. Now, where's the deadweight loss? Well, if we assume, and this is not a heroic assumption, if we assume no spillovers, okay, we assume that it's not a merit good, okay, no spillovers, not a merit good, and no spillovers here. We'll get into the spillovers in more detail in a later chapter, so we're not getting into anything that we're not eventually going to cover. But if we make the no spillovers assumption, then the deadweight loss is, right, because beyond Q0, I've got some numbers there, so let's go ahead and work with those. This is, say this is 350, and this is 650. All right, for the 300 additional units that result from the subsidy, the cost of the additional output is greater than the value to the consumer. It's not worth less, or let me say that again, it's not worthless. It's worth less than what it costs. It's worth something, right? It's above zero. Willingness to pay there, right? It's valuable, but its costs, it's worth less than the additional cost of producing it. What does this mean in terms of healthcare? This means diverting people from becoming engineers into becoming doctors, for example. Right? Part of the opportunity cost of this expansion is we've got to have more doctors. Where are we going to get them from? Well, doctors are highly educated. It means somebody else that would have otherwise probably gone to school to become a scientist at something else. We've got to talk them now into becoming a doctor. Well, how are we going to talk them into becoming a doctor when otherwise they would have been something else? Pay more. Yeah. Okay. We increase the attractiveness of the medical profession, right? And so that's part of this increasing opportunity cost, is we have to make it look more attractive to supply this service compared to something else. See, and that's what this reflects, is we're taking resources from other areas of the economy. Okay, so anyway, there's your deadweight loss that results from expanding medical care through a subsidy based on equity. Again, what does the no spillovers assumption mean? It means that third parties don't benefit from your use of the good. Not true for a contagious disease medicine, right? Third parties do benefit. But for most medical treatments, for most healthcare services, only the person treated gets any benefit. There are some exceptions, but they're the minority, not the norm. Okay, so again, a subsidy is a reverse tax, although subsidies and taxes both increase price. Both of them yield deadweight losses unless you're talking about a merit good or talking about a sin tax. Those are the exceptions. And it doesn't depend on who gets the check from the government or who writes it in the case of a tax. And the benefits of the subsidy or the cost of the tax depend on the relative sizes of the price elasticities of demand and supply. And that's the end of chapter 6. So we'll end the slideshow here for the moment and go on to the top hat questions, which will tell some of you that you should have been less quiet and had more questions. Now, actually, before we do that, why don't we get up here and take attendance? I discovered my first use of this data the other day that I forgot about. Some of you in here are in the athletic department and, student athletes. And so I got an email from the department over there that said, are these people showing up and how are they doing in your class? So I went to the Top Hat data and that told me how often they had put their number in here. So they may have been here and just not entered, but that got them counted as not president. And I'm not sure what the consequences for them over there are for them not seeming to be here, or maybe not actually being here. But anyway, so that was one use of these numbers. Attendance 46. Does that mean how many? No, that's probably about right. Okay, going once, going twice. All right, moving on to the questions. Here we go. Okay, straight to some stuff with a graph. It's exactly the same graph as before, except I switched S0 and S2. Okay, just to kind of go along with the theme of taxes and subsidies are sort of reverse of each other. Remember, you can click on the graph and make it pop up there. And I will click these all into your box after we're done with them so you can ponder them again later on. Think about as you answer this one what it is you're struggling with. What does that word mean? Where does that come from? How do I do something with that? Because that'll tell you what you're not getting and what you need clarified, or what you maybe should have read a little more carefully in the book. And in case you don't know, you can click on the graph, see it on your device, big. All right, I think we spent enough time on that one. All right, so if we go to the graph, and for those of you who haven't paid your Top Hat money, you might want to copy that graph real quick to semi-be with it here with us. Again, student diversity is an unbelievable thing. Some people are parking a Lexus in the student slots, and others can't find the $24 for Top Hat. So, wow. Quite a spread there in terms of willingness and ability to pay. All right, so see, remember this graph from when we did the taxes? S0 was S2 and S2 was S0. Just switch those two around. See, now our starting point is that the price is $20 and the quantity is $3.40. Okay, so now we put on the subsidy. The new supply will be S2. Right? It'll shift down by $12, a la this graph right here, this one. And it'll shift down by the amount of the subsidy. And so you're thinking, okay, well, why wasn't the answer $12? Well, that's the net price to the buyer after being subsidized. The equilibrium price is the one that's being charged. Right? Pay up, you want it, here's what you got to pay me. Okay, so you might have grounds for a question protest there. Well, Doc, but you didn't say net price versus regular price. All right. But the equilibrium price is the one that's actually transacted between the buyer and the seller. And so that would be the $12 plus the $12 tax. Okay? The market price is not going to be $12 after a $12 subsidy goes into effect. It's going to be that plus the $12. Okay, if you look at the graph over on the oops, yeah. If you look at, I drew the arrow wrong, but it's an increase in demand that results, right? So the price is going to be higher, and it's higher by this difference here. See here's where the supply line would in effect be there. So this would be the 12, and that's the 24. Okay, the intersection of S2 and demand is the after the subsidy price to the buyer. Okay, and then that plus the subsidy amount is what the seller ends up collecting. Right, so the seller charges $24, and then wherever the subsidy money comes from, the buyer says, subsidy please, and they get a check for $12 per unit from the government for that. All right, and I'm asking, not telling. Going once, going twice. Okay, same graph. Okay, so if you copied it down, now you can do the problem. I already gave this one away. Oh well. We'll see if you're paying attention. Okay, so like I said, I just did that one, so 12 is the net price. All right. Oops. Guess I could have just said next on that last one. Okay, dead weight loss. Always where you are versus where you should be. Marginal benefit versus marginal cost. Yes?
Why were the last two negative?
Huh?
Why were the last two negative? I get why it was like 12, or why was it negative 12?
Oh, I'm sorry. Those are not minus signs. Those are little squigglies. Sorry about that. Yeah, those are little squigglies indicating that the graph is imprecise, so it's about 12. And I guess it's right, it's about 12. I'm glad you asked that because there's probably why is there a minus sign there? No, there's no minus sign. It's a squiggly. Approximately. Okay, so why is there a see, if you're thinking, okay, let's see, it's this triangle. No. Maybe bleep no. Okay? Thinking, okay, what's a dead weight loss? Oh, a dead weight loss, that's either from overconsumption or underconsumption compared to the equilibrium. Oh, okay, that's what a dead weight, oh, okay. So in this case, which one do we, oh, it's overconsumption. It's going to be more than the efficient amount. And so why is there a dead weight loss? Oh, because the additional cost is more than the additional benefit. Okay, fine. Now you're up to the point where, okay, it's that triangle. But just trying to remember where a triangle is, come on. This is not why you paid your money to go to UTSA, is to have some professor torture you to remember where a triangle is. I can't stop you from turning it into that. Okay, but I can certainly urge you to develop your intellect rather than to torture yourself with memorizing trivia. Okay, just remembering where some triangle is. Come on. No. Don't do that. Think about the concept. Okay, use the model to locate it. Okay, and then the numbers to process it. See, that's why I don't ask questions like a dead weight loss is and then some words to describe it, because you can memorize that without having any idea what it means. But you cannot memorize, in most cases, some people can, they're talented beyond ability, not doing themselves any good with it, but very talented at memorizing lots of things and keeping them all straight. Don't do that. Learn the economics. Get out of the memorize what you don't understand mode if that's what you're used to. I know it's tough. Okay, well, we're still a little ways away. All right, show answer. All right, so let's put the graph up here. The dead weight loss, okay, the original quantity is 340. The quantity will be inflated to 800 as a result of the subsidy. Okay, so an additional 460 units produced, each of which costs more to produce than its value to its purchaser. Okay, so it'll be the area between the demand line and the supply line between 340 and 800. You can't tell exactly where that is because the S0 is a little short, but you can still have no problem at all doing the dead weight loss, because how far apart do you know that they are? They're parallel. They're 12 apart, right? So, in terms of this triangle here, here's your quantity. Okay, yeah, you can't see where S0 is all the way to where 800 is, but there it is. Okay, and you know this is the same as this down here, right? It's parallel. Okay, so if this is 12, so is that, and so this is the 460. Okay, so 460 times 12 divided by 2 is the same thing as 6 times 460, which is whatever that number just was, 2760. Okay, the math should be just kind of a formality, right? It's doing the economics of where is it, okay, what does it mean, where is it, and then based on that, doing a little bit of math. Yes?
So how does the subsidy factor into this specific problem?
How does the subsidy is what increases the supply from S0 to S2. Okay, it's because of the subsidy that the supply shifts. Okay, so in this case, it would be we're subsidizing the seller, right? Shifting the supply. Every time the seller sells a unit of this stuff, they're going to get 12 bucks. So as a result of that, the amount of opportunity cost to them with the subsidy drops by $12. And so the S2 is $12 below S0. Okay, and that produces a new market equilibrium at 800, and those additional 460 units cost more. The supply line is S0 is the cost, the actual opportunity cost of making the good, and then the S2, that's the inflated supply because of the subsidy. That does not reflect the cost of making the good. It reflects the cost after the subsidy has lowered the cost of making the good. Okay, so I'm babbling. Thumbs up or down or okay. It's got to stop me. Yes.
So does S0 drop to 12 or by 12?
By 12. Yes, by 12. Right. So it drops from starting at 18 to starting at 6. Right? If the minimum opportunity cost to make the good, actually produce it, is $18. And now the government's going to send you 12 bucks every time you make one. Now the minimum opportunity cost of making the good, $6. Right? Net of the subsidy payment that you get. No? Still? Okay? You're shelling out 18 bucks to make the first one. That's what the S0 says. Okay? And now somebody's going to give you 12 bucks every time you make it. Well, now you're only out 6 bucks every time you make one, right? Okay. Now, from there on up, right, that's just for the first one, but that anchors our line, and it's the same story. If the 340th one has an opportunity cost of 20, it does. And at 340, supply line is at 20. Okay, that says the 340th one increases costs by $20. Well, now if you get 12 bucks from somebody, now the opportunity cost is only $8, which is why I left that as one of the choices. I figured that some people would do the subtraction there, come up with that, or one of the previous question choices. All right, so, okay. Anything else? Good, we got some questions going here. I thought you guys were just clamped down tight today for some, October, is something happened, month passing. Huh? Oh, because it's a triangle. If you take the base of 12 times the height of 460, that'll give you something that's rectangular or square-shaped. So the economics of the divide by 2 is that the loss, okay, the reduction in the gains from trade varies with quantity. Okay, so the divide by 2 is basically taking an average that says the average loss for each of those 460 additional units is somewhere between 0 for the first one, the 340 first one. Opportunity cost just barely above 20. Okay, and the value just a little bit below 20, not much of a loss there. But the opportunity cost versus the value of the 800th one is, the 800th one has an opportunity as a value of 12, and the opportunity cost is 12 more than that. I know you gave the thumbs up, but that's something that bears some explanation usually for others that didn't think to ask. More Q&A. I mean, that's why we're here. More Q&A is good. Okay, I think we have one more. Okay, so we'll move on to that one. Notice that I've been afraid to click reports. I haven't done that yet. Maybe I should. But no graph on this one. The last one, no graph. I mean, where's the graph? No graph on this one. But it does pertain to this HC service one. That's the one where we went over that. Question, comment, thought? Remember, there's a question multiplier. Others will benefit from your question if you put it out on the floor. See, the 1/5, answer A, the 1/5, that's the buyer's share, the patient share in this case. Take the reciprocal of that. And 80% subsidy means 20% left for the customer to pay. Okay, so their share, reciprocal. Again, the rule of thumb is good. It's a good starting point. But crease the gray matter. Okay? Why does that make sense? Go back to like this. 90 and 30 are equivalent in terms of what the customer has to pay. Okay? Okay, here the patient share was, because I didn't want to make the graph too big, running out of space. The patient share was 1/3. Okay, the rule of thumb says, okay, that'll triple demand, which means the highest willingness to pay will be 3 times more than before. Okay, but go through the common sense of why that rule of thumb is accurate. Okay, a $90 bill where you pay 1/3 of it is the same to the customer as a $30 bill where you have to pay all of it, right? Okay, so if it's 80%, as in the top hat question, 20% means if the bill is $100, okay, you pay $20, which is the same as if you have charge $20 for something and you have to pay all of it. Okay, so make sure you go beyond the memorization of the rule of thumb and actually think through where it came from and why it makes sense. Because I guarantee you, if you ever have to use it, somebody will ask you to explain it to them, and you'll go, I just memorized it from my micro principles. And they'll roll their eyes and think, well, why did they hire you? Yeah. So think through why rules of thumb are rules of thumb. It's nice to have them. You can do things faster that way. That's worth something. But then also you don't have to worry about memorizing something. You can refigure it out I can't remember exactly what that rule of thumb was, but okay. Oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Okay, cool. See, and then you refigure the rule of thumb if you forgot it, if you understand why it's the right answer. All right, there's not enough time to do Chapter 7. If you want to make a 2-minute head start on whatever, do it quietly because others may want to linger the last 2 minutes and have Q&A. Exactly. See, Tyler, right? See, you're getting in the spirit of these things, right? I've got this questionnaire. I prepped them for this. I'm a busy, lazy man. Not really all that lazy, but kind of lazy because I am busy. How could I change this question just a little bit to test whether they get it, but to make sure they just can't memorize it? Exactly. I changed the 80% to 75%. Exactly the same 4 choices, and now D is correct instead of E. Exactly. See you Tuesday.